You're listening to Nightlight Radio Network. This is Dr. Bob Hieronimus, co-host of 21st Century Radio. We are happy to present this rebroadcast of our show on Nightlight. Well, our subject tonight is the famous UFO abduction case of Travis Walton, celebrating its 40th anniversary this month. Well, we have reviewed the new documentary film called Travis that premiered in February at the 2015 International UFO Congress Film Festival in Scottsdale, Arizona, where it swept the EB Awards for the Best Long Documentary Film and the People's Choice Award. Travis is now, well, it's a 90-minute documentary. It's a film recounting of the now world-famous 1975 UFO abduction of Travis Walton and the impact it has had on his life over the intervening 40 years. Wow, that's longer than we've been on the air on 21st Century Radio. Now, on the lives of others who were also involved. Now, you can view the trailer at TravisWaltonTheMovie.com. That's TravisWaltonTheMovie.com. Jennifer W. Stein is a self-taught filmmaker who never went to film school. She is an entrepreneur who started making films in the 1990s while running a non-profit organizations, raising her 2 children, and running a special events business. Well, it looks like she's doing everything. She's an everything type of person. Since 1999, Jennifer has been making documentary films and has won numerous EB Awards for her UFO-related film work. In 2012, Jennifer won 2 Open Minds International UFO Congress EB Film Festival Awards for her co-production of The Disclosure Dialogues with Ron James. She again succeeded in winning 2 more EBs at the 2015 Open Minds Film Festival for her film Travis, the true story of Travis Walton, which she co-produced with Bob Terrio. I hope I pronounced Bob's last name correctly. Did I pronounce Bob's last name correctly?
Yes, you did.
I did. Did I win a prize?
Of course.
Okay, well, I just won 2.
Another DVD.
Okay, thank you. I just also won $200,000 for that one, friends. See what happens when you listen to 21st Century Radio? Or at least what I think that happens. How did you find your way into filmmaking, Jennifer?
Well, I was always trying to do things economically, and I realized that I could do it myself rather than hiring somebody else to do stuff. And that's how I started making films. And then I realized that it was a powerful way to communicate story. Mm-hmm. And I just decided it was more what I wanted to do than run that next bar bat mitzvah or that next, business conference or whatever I was being hired to do in my events business. And I liked the creativity that it provided me. And I knew it was long-range impact. What I was doing was more like performance art, sort of, because I had to have an event ready by a certain date and time. And when I did film, I could, shooting was always intense. That was like an event. But editing I could do till 1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning in the comfort of my own studio. I didn't have to worry about people stealing equipment from me or arguing over, labor laws or union people refusing to turn tables for me to get my wedding off the road because the wedding before ran over or something. So it just seemed like a better, a more powerful and more impactful endeavor for me to sink my teeth into. And I like a challenge, so I certainly bit off more than I thought I could chew in the Travis event.
Well, I'm so glad you did bite off more than you can chew because, usually, especially in the arts, it takes a heck of a lot more to do something really good than most people think. You've just got to put your entire life into it, and obviously you know how to do that with your life. And most other people, I think, would have been maybe a little bit too inhibited to go that way. I remember when I used to get frustrated with photographers not shooting things right and everything like that. That's when I became a photographer a while, but I hated it. And I know just how you feel that, boy, you are in control that way. You don't have to you don't have to discuss, hey, I think this has to happen or that has to happen. You can move along much more rapidly that way for that freedom. But again, it costs you in energy and time, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Everything has a cost. There's no real free ride in life as much as we'd like to think there is.
Yeah, that's true. How did you come up with the name for your production company, On Wings? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Wings?
You are.
And I want another $100,000?
Well, I'll tell you, it stemmed from my maiden name, which was Wing. I am Norwegian, and in my father's ancestral background, so Wing, W-I-N-G-E, is my maiden name.
Oh.
And I wanted to, even though when I got married, I changed my name to Stein, which means stone in German. I wanted to bring back in that energy from my own name, my birth name. So I started email. When I needed to come up with an email account, I used the name Wing, and I put an O-N on the beginning and an S on the end because I needed that many number of letters for the first email account, and it kind of stuck.
Good
and since I had been using On Wings for years, that's where I sort of came up with a name for the production company. I know it's kind of silly and simple, but like they say, don't sweat the small stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it was easy for me to remember, and it kind of brought in. I also was a student of Zecharia Sitchin's, and I studied, the winged disc and the philosophy of Egypt that was related to that concept. Some people think it stretches into the UFO phenomenon. And I liked sort of the metaphysical and spiritual connection that it had.
Yeah, you got multiple levels there, don't you?
Yeah, it was a good, I could do some good drawings with it. I could have a good business card with a winged disc on it. So that's where On Wings production sort of came together.
Well, tell us how the film idea with Travis got started.
Well, it's kind of funny because I really didn't start out to make a UFO film or to really make a full-length version documentary film about Travis. I toyed with the idea, but I wasn't quite sure that I had it in me and that I had the budget or the finances to do it. But I met Travis being introduced by a mutual friend of ours, Bob, actually, Peter Robbins.
Uncle Peter.
Peter and I were, I was assisting Peter when he was running one of the Roswell conferences in Roswell, New Mexico in 2010, and he invited Travis to have dinner with us, and I was thrilled because I, of course, always heard about the Travis Walton story, but I had never met Travis directly. So in 2010, we had dinner together, and we started to talk about the fact that the Roswell conference draws over 10,000 people to the town of Roswell every year. And it's become a major economic boom for that city. And most of the people there are grateful to talk, share, acknowledge the Roswell story. And it's just become a very important conference. So we were having dinner with Travis saying, Travis, your story is just as important as the Roswell story.
Yeah, for
sure. Have you ever considered doing a conference around your story somewhere in northern Arizona? And he had, but of course, running a conference is a lot different than being invited to speak at a conference. It can be daunting putting a conference together. And Peter and I had a lot of experience doing that. I myself professionally, because I was an event coordinator for 15, 18 years, and I'd done weddings, bar and bat mitzvahs, conferences, all sorts of things, you name it. And Peter knew that about me, and Peter also had been a consultant on a lot of conferences like McMinnville and Roswell and Exeter and the Experiencer Speak conference up in Maine, as well as a number of other conferences over the last, 20 years that he's been on the speaking circuit. So he said, how about Jen and I become like conference coaches, and we start meeting and talking and emailing with you about how to put it together. And there are certain logical steps. So one of the things Travis wanted to do, this does get back to the film, and I'll get there quickly, one of the things Travis wanted to do in hosting a conference is to be able to take people back to the actual site where his abduction took place, which was up in the Sitgreaves National Forest. It's a plateau that's about 7,000 feet high. It's the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world. And in November, it could be snowing up there, which actually it did this year at the conference. So if the weather is treacherous, it makes the roads impassable, and taking a group up there that have paid and registered and are happy and excited to go into the forest but actually can't just because of the mud and the difficulty in getting there, we decided we would do a virtual film of the site. Well, or actually not even a virtual film, but like a tour of the site with some of the guys involved from the crew. And in the event that we couldn't take people there, we had a backup in case we sold tickets for $30, $40, or $50 a piece to, hike people up into the forest. We would have a film we could show them. Mm-hmm. So that's what we did. I started out as a conference coach organizing a shoot to create a film, and my co-producer who did the film with me, named Bob Terrio here in Philadelphia, he actually edited that whole piece together himself, and it's called Tracking Skyfire. And it's a recount of that day, that famous historic day of November 5th, 1975, where the boys were picked up, where they lived, had the route they took to get up to the forest, what happened at what time, and, sort of the pursuit that took place for 5 days following that, looking for Travis. It doesn't really go into depth about the polygraph and other things like that, but it's just a short, concise, hour-long, intense documentary on that topic alone. And after
wait a second. Was this the one that we see?
No, the one that you saw was a more elaborate production.
I see.
So Bob and I finished Tracking Skyfire, and Bob did like 99.9% of the work. I did the shooting with him, and I organized the trip out there, and covered all of our expenses and everything to get that done. And we did it in time for a conference that never happened in 2013, but we were hoping it would. We were advising Travis to do conferences every year for 3, 4, or 5 years to build up to the 40th anniversary event so that he would get experience coordinating a conference, or that he would build a crew of people around him who would be able to manage the conference. And people who were on site, because I live in Philadelphia, Peter lives in Ithaca, New York. We weren't on site to run around and hang posters. So he was going to need a crew of people to help him get the conference up and running. But I thought if we had a film, in the event that we couldn't take people to the actual site, that would help. And then when we finished that in 2013, I realized that I could actually add some in-depth interviews with some of the crew people and maybe the polygraph specialist, if he was still alive, some of the police officers at the time, if they were still alive, and possibly some other crew or family members, and really turn it into a really in-depth documentary following Travis's book.
Well, you sure did do that.
Thank you. I
have
really pushed to get it done almost a year in advance of the 40th anniversary. Mm-hmm. So that the film could serve as a promotional platform to bring people out to Heber for this conference, which just happened. We just had the 40th anniversary this past November 5th. It was 40 years to the day, and we had a great conference, and we did show the film there at this conference as well.
Was Peter there this time?
What was who?
Was Peter Robbins there this time?
Peter was there.
He was.
Peter came out. Yep.
God bless
Peter
his
was there.
soul.
The original crew of counselors and coaches were there. We, a group of us, attend UFO conferences regularly. So whenever we found ourselves at a UFO event, like we often did in Arizona at the International UFO Congress, we would meet for breakfast for years and try to plan this conference. And many of the people who were there at those breakfast meetings were all there at the conference. and many of the original crew members as well. Those that are living, most of them were there. There was only one that couldn't make it. That was Steve Pierce. But all the other guys came, and also Kenny Peterson. He was supposed to be there, but a family emergency called him away. So,
how fortunate, and how fortunate for you to have done that hour piece before.
Yes.
Because plenty of times it's when you're the first thing you do that really opens up in yourself and externally as well just how much you can really accomplish or not accomplish. It's like getting there and getting it started. And I think that really made a difference. This was especially good film, especially when we get a chance to talk about one of the greatest things you guys did. You exposed some individuals who are debunkers that have been needed, that research should have been done on these guys for such a long time. And I think you know who I'm talking about. Okay, time out here on the playing field. Our guest is Jennifer Stein.
I'm Zechariah Sitchin. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. I'm always happy to be on your show and on Zoe's show because it makes a lot of difference when the interviewer is knowledgeable and intelligent.
Rules and regulations on 21st Century Radio is that we do read all of our books. And so some of these books, when you got to read them and they're 500, 600, up to 800 pages, that's pretty tough to do. But we do it because we like to learn. Our guest is Jennifer Stein, executive producer and director of Travis, a 90-minute documentary film recounting the famous 1975 UFO abduction of Travis Walton. Oh, gosh, Peter was with us. He was our tour guide to the Statue of Liberty. Last year, we came home last year about 2 days ago. This is quite a whole series of synchronicities. This is quite interesting when things like this happen as far as I'm concerned. You've seen him just yesterday or so?
Travis?
Yeah.
Last week I got home, I guess, on the 15th. I had also gone to the Lachlan UFO Conference that was done in Lachlan, Nevada, November 14th and 15th, and I showed the film there. So I was only, I was with Travis at that conference, so I think I came home Monday the 16th.
Well, I was actually talking about Peter Robbins.
Oh, Peter.
Uncle Peter.
Yes, Peter was there too at the 40th anniversary conference in Phoenix with Travis and I and a group of other people, and I think he went off and did some other traveling as well before he came back to Ithaca.
Well, that sounds like Peter, all right. It really does. How has this film been received by audiences?
Very well, Bob. I have been so pleased. Almost immediately, I was getting phone calls from the International UFO Congress. People who had been at the Congress picked up the film and returned home with it. Some people from Canada, people from Australia, England, even South America, Hawaii. People were calling me to arrange screenings, as well as a number of MUFON groups around the country. They were also calling me because I'm a member of MUFON. So people immediately asked if they could screen it and show it, and I've done a lot of Skype and calls with different groups after the film was shown, if I couldn't be there in person. So I have been very, very pleased with the turnout and the response from the film. People tend to think that the Fire in the Sky film that was done by Paramount in 1993 was telling the true story, and it's really not the true story of what happened to Travis. It's close to the story, but it's a fictionalized version of the story. Mm-hmm. Not all the characters were particularly the same in that film, and the actual events that happened on board the craft were very different. So the audience who sees this film is really very grateful to actually get the facts clear and straight. I think it helps not to muddy the water, especially when you're dealing with a phenomenon that's as out of the box as this one.
Sure.
You really want to have the story straight. And Travis's story is really significant and unique for many reasons, and I think that's what attracted me to wanting to really document and archive this for future generations, because who knows if we're going to have books in another 60 years, right?
Yeah, that's a very sad problem, and I'm so glad you're involved in making sure that people spend some time reading, because it's with the younger people, it's a serious problem.
Yes, the younger generation gets their information in sound bites.
Right.
And they don't know history. And I think that the Travis Walton case is not only a significant UFO story, but it's a significant story for beginning to open people's minds and shift their consciousnesses about the reality of whether or not we're alone in the universe. And there's a good chance we're not.
Oh, I don't think there's a chance in any in the world that we're this. I mean, I think it's overwhelming. But but your film does more than even that. Do you know why? Yes, you'd probably know why.
Well, tell me, Bob.
I'll tell you why. Because you see, we've been doing shows I've been involved in doing shows over 40-some years. But one of the biggest questions that all of us had, especially that back there in the 70s, 80s, and then in the 90s, was who in the world was giving Phil Klass the money to do the kind of things that he was doing?
Yes.
You guys hit it right on the head, and you did it so well. And no UFO researcher there's not a single UFO researcher that should not, let's put it this way. All of them have to see this film, because all of us had our suspicions. But the kind of research you did proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Phil Klass was involved in some ways with the FBI and others, and he was a debunker that was actually paying other people to debunk. None of us could figure this out.
I spent a lot of time reading his files in Philadelphia. It's very interesting to me that his files are archived along with the gentleman who was responsible for the Condon report. His name was Robert Condon.
Yeah.
And also the former head of astronomy from Harvard University.
That's Don Menzel?
Who was a big debunker for a long time. His name was
Don Menzel.
Howard Menzel.
Yeah.
So, and he was like the well-known debunker before Philip Klass was around.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting that their documents are archived in the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, but so are Philip Klass's.
Yeah.
And it takes an awful lot of money and time and energy, and, you have to be really considered someone very significant and important for 20th century thinking to have your material archived in a place like this. I mean, my gosh, they've got Thomas Jefferson's, right, and Ben Franklin's, and, a lot of other very significant people from history, but why is Philip Klass considered an important person from history? It's not like he was, the head of an astronomy department at a university. He was just a writer from Air and Space magazine, or Aviation Weekly. So why? I think it's quite clear that there is a desire to archive the debunking that he deliberately did on this topic so that people researching famous UFO stories would come across it and still consider a bunch of these stories bogus. But, of course, in Travis's case, the more you read and the more you dig, the more you realize how insane his arguments were and how he took things out of context. He twisted words around. He deliberately repeated things in shorter sentences, dropping out very critical parts of conversations.
Yes.
So that the meaning was changed in many cases. And he did this to certainly everyone involved in the Travis case. I mean, he didn't reach out to Travis, which was interesting, I guess because Travis was a little untouchable. And Philip's idea was that Mike Rogers had come up with this cockamamie idea of getting out of a forestry contract and still getting paid, and therefore ripping off the federal government because the Forestry Service is part of the federal government. So he, it went as far as a federal investigator being hired to come up with several indictments against Mike Rogers, which all could not be proven, and therefore they had to be completely dropped. He even said that Mike had come up with a fictitious person whom was really a member of his family, who I think worked for the Forestry Service. And this federal investigator showed up at a family reunion attempting to arrest Mike, and he couldn't because none of the counts of indictment were true. And that really frustrated Philip Glass to no end.
Well, I'm glad it did, because he has done so much damage.
Yes.
So much, because the media, the media is who is ever in control of it. It doesn't necessarily mean you're getting any facts off of anything, but the media uses shortcuts, and they would always go to Phil Glass, and he would forever debunk just about any UFO story. But and with this particular case here with Travis, he was trying to locate, I don't know how many people you have discussed in the book, of giving them $10,000. He would go to them and say, "We will give you this $10,000 if you will debunk
this case."
And he could get no one.
Right.
He could get no one.
He actually particularly targeted the youngest member of the crew, named Steve Pierce, because he thought that the youngest one needed the money and might actually take it and then sort of go into hiding. Mm-hmm. Steve was harassed quite a bit, as all the men were on this story. Steve actually moved out of town. He moved to Texas, and he started using his middle name, Jeff, instead of his first name, Steve. And Philip chased him down, actually flew out to Texas, took him out to dinner, and tried to convince him to say that this wasn't true. And what's very interesting is that it's not really clear how Philip would have proved that it wasn't true, because Steve had already passed a lie detection test, mm-hmm. stating that it was in fact true that they had seen a UFO and that Travis had been hit by it and he had gone missing. So exactly how was Philip going to prove that this was a lie? I mean, that was still part of the required, I'm assuming, the required contract, but we don't actually know. And Travis actually thinks that maybe Philip knew that Steve was, couldn't retract the lie detection test, and it was probably a promise that Phil was never going to have to pay, but maybe he could trick Steve into some sort of a statement and then never fulfill on the payment. So It's really not clear, but what's also very interesting is there was a local sheriff in Holbrook that delivered, it was either Holbrook or Snowflake, that actually delivered this written bribe. It was sent via, I think, Western Union or something. So there is actually documentation that this was a true bribe that was delivered. Whether or not he called the police department and asked one of the sheriffs to deliver it, I think his name was Click or Flick or Flake or something like that. One of the local police officers actually went to Steve Pierce's house, tracked him down through his mother, and then delivered the bribe to Steve.
Well, the entire group, of course, including Travis, took many lie detector tests.
Yes, it wasn't just one.
Okay, how many did they fail?
They didn't fail any of them. There was one guy that had an inconclusive because he got all flustered and he didn't finish the test and he walked out. And I think that was Alan Dallas.
Yeah, that was in the very beginning, though.
That was in the very beginning. That's when Travis was still missing. And these boys were essentially being accused of murder.
That's right. Yeah.
And they were afraid that if they, by taking this test, that would be they would be tricked somehow into admitting a murder that they didn't do, and they would be arrested and thrown in jail and possibly tried for murder and maybe even spent the rest of their lives in prison if Travis didn't come back. I mean, there were a lot of unknowns going on. It's probably why this case made international news, because it was immediately a homicide story, a UFO story, and a missing person story, and bizarre at that. So once it was out of the box, the story was out of the box, right? You couldn't, pack it back into some neat little story of some, misidentified missing person or some object or something that was misidentified. There were over 500 people looking for Travis in the woods. I mean, everybody knew about this in northern Arizona.
And again, the film does this so well. You get to see how much damage to all of the people that were involved in it when they had to face. And of course, they didn't necessarily. There were times when they weren't too happy with Travis. Is that correct?
Correct. I mean, Travis wasn't the only one getting ridiculed.
Yeah.
But, everyone in the town was getting ridiculed, especially the people involved in the case.
We have a timeout here on the playing field on 21st Century Radio. As a matter of fact, yes, our guest is Jennifer Stein. She's the executive producer and director of Travis, a 90-minute film documentary recounting the famous 1975 UFO abduction of Travis Walton. That was a segment from Dr. Queen Zahara's interview with Travis back there in 1993 on, that was The Fire in the Sky. That's when it was called then. Yes, indeed. And I was a bit disappointed in that particular film. I'm sure Travis was too, and I bet you were too, weren't you, Jennifer?
Well, I at the time when I first saw it, it was the best thing that was out there, and I think it brought a lot of people's attention to this interesting story. But since it changed the facts, it really led people astray as well.
Yeah.
And I think it painted not really the correct light on the whole topic, because if you know the true story, it really begins to open your consciousness, and you want to read and learn more, and you're fascinated by this amazing event.
How did you get the archived footage?
Well, I worked with Stanton Friedman, and if you remember, Stanton says in the documentary, he says, I was hired to be a co-script writer and a consultant on a documentary film about the UFO topic, and this was done in 1978. So it was through Stanton that I contacted the producer he worked with, and he was still alive. His name was Brandon Chase, and he lives in California. So I called the Chases up. Their phone still worked, and I convinced them to let me use the footage in the Travis Walton film for the 40th anniversary event that we were doing. And that's how I came across it.
Well, Stanton Friedman has been a real pillar in the research community in this area. He's one of the great leaders.
Yes, he is.
I hope he lives another 50 years or so.
From your mouth to God's ears. Me too.
Yeah, great man. Did you have any challenges while filming?
Yes, we did. There were all sorts of there's always issues that come up. You always have mic issues and whatnot. The location up in the forest was quite difficult to get to, especially with a lot of equipment, because you had to hike in there, and it's about maybe, a quarter of a mile hike from the nearest road, from the rim road. So we eventually, Travis and I, making so many trips back and forth to the car and up to the site and back and forth, that we finally decided we'd clear a path. So we spent a half a day moving boulders and chopping down small trees in order to drive closer into the site so we didn't have to schlep so much equipment. I was convinced we were going to actually destroy the rental car I had arranged to get. But we didn't, and that was a challenge. We also used, we had a wonderful camera assistant who came up from the Gilbert area in Arizona that Travis had found. His name is Gary Hilton, and he flies a helicopter drone. It's a small little camera mounted on this cute little drone that lifts up into the air, and we lost one of those in the forest. So Travis and I actually had to spend a day finding it, and we were, worried we were going to be lost, run out of water, run out of cell phone power, and not really know where we were because we had to hike into a part of the forest that was sort of, off the beaten track, so to say. We wanted to capture this beautiful rim that you hear described so beautifully. We wanted to capture this plateau. So we took a risky move and we decided to fly a drone off a very rocky, steep cliff in 60-foot ponderosa pine trees. And sure enough, the drone was challenged by the wind gusts that were up there, and it tipped it sideways. It lost power, and it dropped into this forest. And it's about a $2,000 piece of equipment. So we decided we had to go looking for it. And there was no, organized path to get there, so to speak. And it was, that was a little challenging.
How did you is that how you got the aerial shots above the forest floor?
Yes, that's how we got it.
That's really impressive filmmaking.
Yes.
Really, it is.
Yes.
Again, great camera people and a drone. Boy, I didn't know how you got. And you didn't have that much experience with drones yourself, right?
I didn't know how to fly them at all, and you actually are not allowed to fly them unless you are an experienced pilot and you have a pilot's license, because they don't want these running into airplanes. And if you could send it 5 miles up, and literally it could fly into a prop plane or into an engine of a jet or something and cause that plane to crash. So you have to know what you're doing with these. It's no easy feat.
Wow.
And I was very, very, very grateful that Gary was interested in our project and came up and helped us with it.
Now, before we go into next hour, are you going to be with us a little bit next hour?
Yes, I am. I'm going to be standing by. I understand you'll be with Travis, and if there's a problem with his phone or anything like that, I'll be here.
Good going. Now, why, again, I'm going to repeat this. We touched on it in the beginning. Why has Travis's case remained one of the most famous cases of UFO abduction on record?
Well, there aren't too many cases where there are 7 people that observe a craft, that there's a direct encounter where someone goes missing, and someone's missing 5 days, and all the crew members who were on this crew took lie detector tests, and eventually all passed these lie detection tests, and the whole town was involved in hunting for him. So the number of people involved in this case is huge from the get-go. And, again, lie detection is something that's quite expensive to have done.
Is.
So for them to have taken multiple lie detection tests or polygraph tests, it's almost unheard of in a UFO case. So it brings more validity to the story. And then when you start to explore what Travis actually experienced, encountering more than one type of species, and seeing more than one type of craft, and being in some sort of aircraft hangar maybe, or underground bunker or mothership somewhere up in the air. I mean, we don't know where he was, but his descriptions are fascinating. And he also did not have the typical type of abduction as was portrayed in the Fire in the Sky film. It wasn't a abduction in the case where he's knocked out. Well, yes, he was knocked out, but it wasn't like he was taken while he was asleep or he was paralyzed. When Travis woke up on that table, he had full control of his abilities, although he was in a weakened state. But he had full memories of what happened to him. Nothing about his memories were suppressed or needed the actual regression to come forward. He was only regressed because of the post-traumatic stress he was experiencing. So his case is very unique. And one other thing I like to point out to people is that Travis never had a choice to come forward or not, which is what a lot of people do, think a lot about. If they say they get a regression, they realize they've had an abduction experience or they have missing time. Nobody knows about it, so they can keep it quiet if they don't want to come forward with it. But Travis never had a choice. He was famous while he was missing because it broke as a homicide story and as a missing person story and a UFO story. So by the time he came back, there had been hundreds of people who had been looking for him for 5 days in the woods. So there was no putting it back in Pandora's box.
And it must have been so hard for the others because they were being charged, many people, especially even members in their family, certainly people in the town, thought that they indeed may have murdered Travis.
That's right.
And they were all very close to him. I mean, that's what is so ironic about this, because they were a real team. This was a team that worked hard for years together. Lifetime friendships and things of that nature. So it was it's quite different than most any other case that I've ever seen or read about. But I got to tell you again, what you accomplished by setting the record straight in regards to especially the debunking is much more important than I think, most people would first understand, because I'm sure you were conscious as to what was going on back there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with debunking, and you especially a broadcaster like ourselves, we were forever attacked by doing any shows on UFOs and that kind of thing, and it really I think what it did for that particular crew is that they really bonded in such a way that they became much stronger, but boy, they still had a lot of pain to go through. It takes an awful lot to be put down time in and time again. I'm an artist, you're an artist, you know how it is. You're always going to be criticized no matter what, right?
Right.
There's no way in the world you're going to please over 30 or 40% of the people, especially when you're doing work that happens to have any important history to it. So what would you like to leave with us before we go into next hour and brother Travis is going to join us?
Well, I would just say to your listening audience, you're in for a treat. You're going to get to talk to the man himself.
Now this guy obviously has really knows himself. You know that old phrase, "Man, know thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man." Remember that one? As above, so below. Yes. He has been through the worst of things, and now I can't say he's going to be going through the best of things, but it's a heck of a lot better than it used to be. And we'll be back with our guest Jennifer Stein and, of course, Travis Walton in just 5 or 6 minutes. This is 21st Century Radio. I'm what's left of the alleged Dr. Bob Hieronimus, a lowly Ph.D. hanging out in this part of the universe. And, of course, it's such a big place, I hardly know where it is most of the time. Our executive producer and research assistant, who is my boss and likes to push me around an awful lot, and she gets away with it all the time because she's bigger than I am. And Noah Dankner, who holds the world's record of bench pressing 622 pounds. Now, that's a lot of weight, it's true. But, Noah Dankner is less than 115 pounds. How does he do it? Well, he must have a couple of UFOs helping him along the way. And, of course, we are going to be joined tonight by 2 people this hour. Jennifer Stein, she's the executive producer and director of Travis, a 90-minute documentary film recounting the famous 1975 UFO abduction of Travis Walton, and we'll be joined by Travis in just a little while, too. Now, let me give you an introduction to Travis. Sit up straight out there. No talking. That's right. Feet flat on the floor, eyes straight ahead. And you can chew gum. We allow you to chew gum every now and then. Now, Travis Walton was born February the 10th, 1953. He was an American logger who was allegedly abducted by a UFO on November 5th, 1975, while working with a logging crew in the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. Walton could not be found, but he reappeared after a 5-day search. The Walton case has received mainstream publicity and remains one of the best-known instances of alleged alien abduction. UFO historian Jerome Clark, an old friend of ours, remember he did the UFO volumes 1 and 2. He gave us a half a dozen of them. We passed them out to the rest of the planet, and boy, do they love them. And he writes that, quote, "Few abduction reports have generated as much controversy as the Walton case. It is furthermore one of the very few alleged alien abduction cases with some corroborative eyewitnesses, like 6 others, and one of the few alleged abduction cases where the time allegedly spent in custody of the aliens plays a rather minor role in the overall account." UFO researchers Jenny Randalls, and there's a fellow here by Peter Halge, or Hugh, well, it's going to be one or the other, write that, quote,
"Neither before or since has an abduction story begun in the manner related by Walton and his co-workers."
That's the voice of authority. It didn't sound like it, did it? Well, furthermore, the Walton case is singular in that the victim vanished for days on end with police squads out searching. It is an atypical close encounter of the fourth kind, CE4, which bucks the trend so much that it worried some investigators, others to defend it. Now, I don't know if Travis has gotten back to us yet. Are you with us? Yes? Yes, he is. Indeed. Travis?
Hello.
Hello, Travis. How are you tonight?
I'm fine.
That's a good thing, too. Do you know you joined us on 21st Century Radio back in 1993 when my wife interviewed you and you did a great job. Remember that?
Yeah,
you do.
That just stands out.
Well, she's she is a really good interviewer, and you did a great interview there. And we have some cuts here that we might play during this hour of that. But the last time you joined us was March 8th, 1993. Your experience is now referred to as one of the most significant UFO events in history. Why do you believe that it is?
Well, I mean, there's a whole lot of factors. I think that having 6 witnesses was very important. And even at the time, Dr. Harder made the point that if you had 6 witnesses who said that they saw someone commit a murder, that would be considered an open and shut case.
Yeah.
But somehow, that when it's a UFO involved, even when the 6 witnesses pass lie detector test, people are still nitpicking and
I'll say
expressing doubt, and that it's really strange. Either we're setting the bar too low for the death penalty, or we're setting it artificially high for UFO cases.
Oh, I'm certain it's been set way too artificially high. Carl Sagan's made sure of that. Now, would you share with us, we haven't mentioned the names of your logger crew who experienced seeing you blasted by light and they thought you were dead at that time, and how this event changed both your life and your crew's lives forever, didn't it?
Yeah, Mike Rogers was the boss, and, he was the focus of a lot of the accusations just because he was the crew boss. But some of the attempts to discredit the case also focused on the youngest member of the crew, who was Steve Pierce. He was only 17 at the time. He actually, lied to Mike and told him he was older than that in order to get the job. But the second oldest was Ken Peterson, and then there was Dwayne Smith, Alan Dallas, and John Goret, rounding out the 7 men.
Well, it's very unusual to have 6 witnesses, and then yourself, of course, continuing to exist after something like this. And, the film that was done, Travis, the film that was done was, in my opinion, really extraordinary. And we've been talking to Jennifer Stein about it last hour, and she's still with us at this time right now listening in. One of the things that I found amazing, and I really enjoyed your comments on this, when you guys really looked into the individual Phil Class. Remember Phil Class?
Oh, yeah. He, is best known and relevant to this case with coming up with a $10,000 bribe offered to Steve to try to discredit it. Mm-hmm. And, it sure makes you wonder that why anyone, if they sincerely believed it wasn't real, would feel that a bribe was the way to discredit the case.
Well, we always heard about these bribes, but we never knew where he was getting his money.
Obviously, with his nature of his work, he couldn't have had that much extra money laying around. And so getting a hold of, through the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI investigation file on Philip Class, document in there was a memo from J. Edgar Hoover himself to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And, these documents are available to anyone through the Freedom of Information Act, basically turning the case over to the CIA. Mm-hmm. And this is a standard, recruiting tactic for the CIA, to get some prosecutable offense that they can use to, leverage cooperation from people. And, of course, the money I would expect would come from whatever agency wound up, being his handler.
Well, again, as I mentioned to Jennifer, this is a truly remarkable expose that you guys did in this film. Every UFO researcher has that was serious about this work has had to put up with his, I'll call it insanity. There's something wrong with this man. I've never met, and of course I've met him, never met a meaner spirited person in my life.
Truly nasty. Yes,
and the fact is that everybody in the media, especially the national media, they'd always have him on. They'd always have him on, and he'd always say the same kind of things. And sometimes they would almost catch him. Like one of the things he loved to do was near the end of any interview, if he's debating somebody, he would make a statement like, "Hey, well, I got that information, and I'd love to share it with you. It's in the glove compartment of my car, and if you let me go out there and go get it, I could read it over the air." And of course they say, "No, we haven't got time for that." And of course at the end of the program, it was overheard that really he didn't have anything like that in his glove compartment. It was a total bluff. He'd get away with all kinds of things like that.
And actually altering quotations. I mean, I would challenge any of his surviving fellow skeptics to justify altering a sentence to reverse the meaning in order to make it look like somebody said something that actually the total opposite of what was actually said.
Yeah. Well, he did that often. And I'm so glad that people documented this because, he was fair-haired with the government. He was fair-haired. And yet in that report that you mentioned, I don't know if it was J. Edgar Hoover that said, this guy's, they had checked into his credibility, and they didn't think he was too credible.
Yeah, they said the Bureau should be most circumspect in any future dealings with him. And they actually said, let's see, what was it? Didn't seem to be in full possession of his faculties.
I mean, that's an awful lot to say, Travis. Jeez, whiz.
Well, these government agencies have what they call useful idiots, They don't have to respect people to make use of them.
Yeah, well, he really caused lots of difficulties for more than half the planet. Now, how did it affect your relationship with the rest of the crew, your family and friends and neighbors about this, especially after you were gone for 5 days?
Well, the crew was, for the most part, people I didn't hang around with much, Generally speaking, everybody, had their own lives away from the job, and we were really just together as a work crew. So, the job went away as a result of the incident, so, we didn't really have that much reason to, continue to associate. Plus, in search of work, they went to various other places, other states. So it kind of broke us up and split us up in a way, but we've still, in more recent years tried to reconnect because we shared an experience that was so profound that, it'll always link us in terms of, a really profoundly life-altering experience.
Yeah, well, it's now the other wonderful experience I had in watching this a couple of times the other night was the lie detector tests.
At the time, the president of the American Polygraph Association said that the odds were over 1,000,000 to 1 of there being any kind of mistake when you have that many people passing tests on the same issue. And that was when 6 tests were passed, but now there's been 16 passed tests in connection with this incident. I've passed 5 different tests from 3 different examiners who were, at the top of their game. As far as polygraphy is concerned, those who do work for law enforcement are considered, the better qualified.
Again, within the film itself, you can begin to experience some of the things. Watching the film as it evolved made me feel more or less like I, for the first time, truly understood what the heck was really going on. Because I got confused back when they're in the 1978. I have your 1978 book here. I never got your 1995 one. And I wanted to ask you one question, but I'll have to ask you that question after we come back from our break. And is that okay?
Okay, I'll talk to you after the break.
All right, after the break, we'll talk about that. We'll be back with our guest, Travis Walton, and, of course, Jennifer Stein.
Hi, everyone. This is Betty.
And Bob Luca, and you're listening to
21st Century Radio, the Bob Hieronimus Show.
I just love her energy. Okay, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. We're talking about a movie you gotta see. It's called Travis. It's a 90-minute documentary film recounting the famous 1975 UFO abduction of Travis Walton. And it is important for many, many reasons. I've already mentioned why I think it's super important in that what it reveals about Don Menzel and Phil Klass, but also about the media. And Jennifer Stein is still with us, and I'm going to ask her a question I should have asked her before, and then we'll get back to Travis. Jennifer, are you there?
Yes, I'm
okay.
here.
All right. Are you sitting up straight?
I think I am.
Okay, and your feet are flat on the floor, your eyes are straight ahead, and you're not talking to anybody else, right?
Correct.
All right, that's the way to go. But you can chew gum. We're still allowed. Now, how complicit is the media in deliberately debunking or lying to all of us, destroying the reputations of lives of those who just wanted to know the truth? I'm biased in this particular area, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you.
Well, media that's paid by large conglomerates these days are really not willing to share the real stories or the true stories. Every once in a while I catch a news clip about a sighting that's happened, and there's usually a joke made somewhere around the news table debunking the seriousness of the topic. Mm-hmm. Now, I can say for myself, if I refer to myself as media, I'm independent media. I pay for and underwrite the productions that I do, and I'm very serious about it. I think you're only going to find independent filmmakers like James Fox and a few other people that are really willing to tackle this topic. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say there is a new television show produced in California called Hangar One, and that they're covering MUFON files and investigations. There's a couple of other serious programs now out, Ancient Aliens and things like that. They're trying to do a decent job covering this topic. But generally, news media and even press print don't take the topic seriously. And I don't think they're allowed by the owners of the papers and the networks. And I think that's why they don't address it. I think they're given direct orders not to.
I think you're absolutely right. You have just won a free trip to Bermuda and about $15,000. How do you like that? I think that's exactly right, because we do the same thing you do. We pay for this show. We don't have any advertisers. We have learned that advertisers will try to affect your programming sooner or later.
Yes.
And we obviously were into this for the experience of educating and especially getting other people to read books, and that's the reason why I put so much emphasis on books. So let me ask Travis. Travis?
Yes.
Did you hear my question about the media? Would you like me to read it again?
Yeah, and it's they don't have to actively reinstitute this prohibition. Once they've got it going, so where it goes without saying that this is not a worthy or serious topic, then they don't have to say it anymore, and it's a credibility issue. And I think the debunkers and those, especially the debunkers that are sponsored by the government, have helped to foster this attitude amongst the media by mockery and also creating a false impression that UFO investigators just believe everything, and that's not the case at all. All of the investigators that were interviewed for the Travis film are people who have looked objectively at huge numbers of cases and will say, this is not a legitimate case, and this one is. So, it's a false impression that they just, are uncritical, when they actually do have some very strict investigative protocol to separate the good cases from those that are, explainable in other terms.
Yes. And of course, has the media let up on you yet?
Well, I think things have actually improved. It's remarkable. There was a television interview here recently that was quite favorable, and the local paper did a front page article that was very favorable. So there's been a sea change, and it's because the kind of evidence that is presented in this film is filtering out, and it's finally getting through to people near and far, and it's something that's taken on a life of its own. I'm getting emails and contact from around the world in some very obscure places that you never would have thought, Tanzania and Moldova, and so some pretty exotic places.
You know who would have really loved to have read your book and seen your film? Jimi Hendrix. Did you know he had UFO sightings?
Well, it's not just him. It's a lot of musicians.
Yeah.
Developed a theory about this, that there's something called an alien muse. In other words, a lot of creative people, not just in music, but in acting and even in scientific areas, have had their experiences that inspire them to, to a higher level of, I think it's their own product, but it's inspiration.
Well, I know that also, of course, John Lennon had an experience there in New York City yet, sitting out on his little balcony at the hotel with his girlfriend at that time. It certainly wasn't his particular wife at that time. And he's sitting out there naked and seeing a UFO come in about 300 or 400 feet above their hotel. That's quite an experience that doesn't change. But I found out that there are many individuals I know who would love to see one. For most of all, Ziggy Marley and the Marley family, because I know that again you have a very close tie. A lot of rock and rollers just are deeply involved in this. Paul McCartney, etc. Well, anyway.
Well, Muhammad Ali came here
that's right.
to train for the next fight immediately after my experience here.
Well, I'll be. What a synchronistic experience that must have been.
Yeah.
Did you ever get a chance to talk to him?
Well, no, I didn't, but I understand that he actually stayed in the place where I just had my 40th anniversary conference.
Isn't that something?
Commemorating this.
Yeah. Well, what I was heading to talk to you a little earlier about is I've read your 1978 book. I never did see, I think my wife got your 1995 book, so I never got a chance to see Fire
Well, that
in
was
the
96, I think, but there's actually a 2010 edition too. But
oh, really?
Yeah, it's twice the size of the original.
Well, so you must have new information in there?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'll be. Yeah, I've always loved the photographs of the paintings. You want to mention anything about the artist who did some of the paintings? Well,
it was Mike Rogers.
Mike Rogers.
So, it started with him trying to, combine the crew's descriptions of the craft itself. And when, I could see what he could do, I said, well, hey, how about, trying to represent the creatures I saw? And that was a laborious process. I'm sure he was losing patience with me because I made him do it over like 20 times. No, that's not quite it. But, it was, he was inspired to paint better than he ever had in his life.
Well, I wonder if he was ever what used to be called by Paul McCartney, overshadowed in this experience. I don't think you would accept this theory, or necessarily Jennifer, but I don't think this was an accident that it happened to you. I know that you at first your views of that abduction have changed a bit since over the last 40 years.
Oh yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that, because there is so much fear about these things, and yet you said some amazing things in this film, Travis. You sounded more like you were becoming a philosopher.
Yeah, it definitely inspired me to try to make some sense of it. And it was a long, slow process. At first, the horror of it, the impact of the experience itself, and then the terrible way I was treated in the media and the public reaction was very, very hard to cope with. So, I had to dig deep. I had to do a lot of thinking. At the time the incident happened, it was just so totally terrifying that I, basically, lost control of my, courage, my fear. It just overcame me in a way that, it's just hard to explain. And I've tried to, lay out the factors that made me lose control so completely. Mm-hmm. To regain consciousness and feel immediately the pain, the something desperately wrong inside. That's the beginning feeling. And then the feeling that I can't get enough air, that I'm struggling to breathe, and it's just, it's a suffocating feeling, and suffocation is something that will generate panic. To suddenly see these creatures so close and realize, where I was.
You want to describe these creatures?
Well, they were hairless, very small, but had huge heads with huge eyes, and those eyes were the thing that really bored into me, literally. And I've come to think that perhaps, that they're psychic, for want of a word, ability to control people comes from the eye. Mm-hmm. And, that was driven home to me here recently. I had a medical doctor at one of my conferences that came up to me and said, it is a fact that the eye is actually an extension of the brain behind it. There's an opening through the skull. If you were going to try to project some sort of energy from the brain, it would make sense that it could come through these eye stalks towards the front of the head. And so, I'm thinking that that was what was so painful for me, because they were trying to control me, and it wasn't working because of the injury that I had sustained in being struck by that blast of energy.
Mm-hmm. But your feelings about that experience now are that maybe it wasn't as bad as you thought it was.
Yeah, it made it seem, extremely threatening, mortally dangerous. But
is that because of the fear of the unknown?
That was definitely a huge factor.
Yeah.
The pain, the claustrophobic, the dimly lit, cramped interior, all of those things, feeling trapped, and perhaps, the weakness I was feeling. I'm trying to escape and trying to fight, and my body's just not responding, to feel the urge to be quick, and you can't quite muster the ability to move quickly.
Sounds like a bad dream. Yeah.
But, there's a lot of other factors that took me a long time to realize that if they had meant harm or meant to cause me pain or anything like that, it would have been much different.
Mm-hmm.
That I was returned at all, and to a place where I could get help, weighed very heavily on my side that there had to be some sort of, concern for my welfare.
They must have, because as you mentioned, and of course it's in the film, the book, you were dropped. Was it 8 feet or so? You were lifted and you were dropped?
Well, I don't know, because I was unconscious during that period.
Oh, that's right. It was the other crew that said that they saw you drop or hit the ground.
Yeah, they said it was thrown through the air, but that was probably an accident.
And that you thought, and then later you thought that, hey, that they may have brought you into the craft to heal you.
Yeah, to revive me, And it's possible, the violence of that blast of energy throwing me through the air, and I'm, they described my body hitting the ground like a dead man, and just, John said like a sack of meat, like a sack of bones, and they immediately were screaming at each other. They said that he's dead, because it was that violent. So, if they had, just grabbed my body up and took off, I'd have probably been dead. The nearest hospital was over an hour away. Mm-hmm. So it's probably a good thing that they were frightened away long enough for me to be taken aboard and revived.
Well, that's a real experience of growth there. Wow. Because, we've done some interviews with my dear friend David Jacobs, and he has a book out now that we're sending a copy to you. I don't necessarily believe it all, but it's called Walking Among Us, the Alien Plan to Control Humanity. Have you heard about it yet?
I've heard of his, he's a good friend, but I just do not agree with his take on these things, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling circumstance when any description of alien-human interaction that varies from this very limited scenario is really just a screen memory. I mean, you could just as easily claim that the terrifying part's a screen memory. I mean, if you go to try to accept this part and reject that part on the basis of what,
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your perspective on that, because I think it's important. And if you'd rather us not send you this book, we'll send you a different one.
Oh, I'd like to look at it. I'm open-minded, but
okay.
There's so many circumstances pointing in the direction of benevolence rather than malevolence.
That's correct. We got to take a final break here, and when we come back, we'll be talking more with our guests, Travis Walton and Jennifer Stein. I've got another question I want to ask her before everything closes down here on 21st Century Radio, so stay tuned.
This is Dr. John Mack, author of Passport to the Cosmos, Human Transformation and Alien Encounters. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Sure do miss you, John. But I know you're you're a lot happier now than you probably ever have been for some time. Our guests are Jennifer Stein, the executive producer and director of Travis, a 90-minute film documentary recounting the famous 1975 UFO abduction of Travis Walton. Of course, Travis Walton is also here. You know, I don't believe we have these kinds of experiences by accident, but I'm biased. I'm very biased. I believe that there's a reason and there's a purpose to everything in life. I'm going to start with you, Jennifer. Are you there?
I'm here.
Jennifer, what do you think about that statement? It sounds like a pretty corny statement, but that's what I believe. I believe that there's a reason and purpose in everything that happens to us in life. And how do you feel about that?
Well, I don't know. You know, we live with such a blinded perspective on the nature of the larger universe in our lifetimes. So it's very, very tricky to know if everything we do has a purpose. I'd like to think it does, and I try to live my life in a purposeful way. And, of course, at the end of my life, I'm going to want to be able to look back and say, well, I did some important things, and they had a purpose. I think what we do have, Bob, is we have the opportunity to take events that happen to us and you know, shift them. We can shift our perspectives on them. We can shift our memories on them. And we can shift how other people think about them. That's certainly something Travis has done through this film and through his life, through writing his book and through dealing with really what happened to him. And so did the other men in this crew. And I'm hoping that when people see this film, it brings some closure and some healing and some purposefulness, at least to what happened to them. And it helps shift people in their thinking about the whole UFO topic in general. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's what I'll give it for tonight.
Well, you know, I know that there are researchers such as Bud Hopkins and John Mack and scores of others. They felt that there was some reason in why they were involved or how they got involved, and of course many of it was basically they were quite concerned by those who were abductees and having these experiences and losing control of their lives. And the way the media treated them certainly did not make it easier for them to regain control of their lives. So that was one of the reasons why I was so proud of Bud Hopkins and John sticking their necks out there, because they didn't make very much money on this. That's probably one of the things that the earmarks for most of the people that get involved with serious research. It's not the making of the money. It's not the becoming a star. It is resolving certain information, or especially in regards to the unknown, that there is life in the rest of the universe, and we're not alone. We never have been. That's my bias in this particular area. What do you think?
You know, I'll take the last part first. You know, the idea that, you know, when people and it comes down to what people want to believe. Those who don't want to believe, no amount of evidence will ever be enough for them. For those who have experienced it, no more proof is necessary. But the people who don't want to believe it always go to that money thing. Oh, you must be getting rich doing that. Nobody, not Jennifer with this film, none of the investigators, nobody could possibly be motivated by the money that's in this field, because that's not there. You know, it's a spice, it's a labor of love, and it's a dedication to an idea or a collection of ideas. And, you know, what you were saying about you think that, you know, you're in control of your life, that's a profound question. And like you said, I've become quite the philosopher. You know, in my book, even the 2010 edition, I quote Aristotle saying, you know, that we shouldn't. You know, I was talking about all the coincidences that had happened, and I said we shouldn't attach too much significance to coincidence, because, as Aristotle said, it's inevitable that the unusual will sometimes occur. Mm-hmm. In other words, these things happen. It just even when line up in spectacular ways, chance would suggest that eventually that's going to happen anyway. But I've really had some things come into my life in the last 6 years that really have pushed me in the other direction.
Tell us about
big on the idea of free agency. But, it really seems like the universe delivers circumstances and events at times that are just defy coincidence. Too many, a long series of incidences for it to just be a random accident.
Can you give us some examples in your life?
Well, a lot of them are personal, but, I listed some of the coincidences that were just in connection with the connection between the various people, the actors, and how these things just kind of, it's just kind of curious, mm-hmm. that one of the extras was a cousin and, that I'd never met. And, one of the documentaries that had been done on my case was narrated by James Earl Jones.
Whoa, boy.
Played across from Arnold Schwarzenegger, who played across from Robert Patrick, who played Mike Rogers in Fire in the Sky. So lots of coincidences about, mm-hmm. People, places, and things.
What do you think the purpose was with you in this particular experience?
Well, I've really resisted that it was me being their plan. Now, Steve and Alan, really go in. Now I think Kenny's leaning that way, that they were laying for us, that they were waiting for us, that they knew we would be coming there. And, there's several routes that we could have left the contract, so they would have had to have been right on top of things or they observed that we were leaving by the way. Mm-hmm. And so, like I said, I've resisted the idea. And when I jumped out of the truck and headed towards there, Alan was saying that it looked to him I was being drawn towards it. He said this summer in an interview, and Steve has said this, that he thought it was under some outside control. But I've always said, hey, wait a minute. It felt to me like it was my own brazen impulse.
Yeah, because you wanted to get as close to it as possible. Am I wrong?
Yeah. To get a closer look. I was curious. I thought it would take off. All those ideas were in my head, but they argued, well, if they have mind control, they can make it your idea too.
Yeah, I guess they could. But there have been many experiences in which UFOs took off immediately when someone came towards them in the past. Yeah. So you had every reason to believe that that's quite possible for them to get up and go. Because from what I understand, it could be ships like that could have some type of radiation that might not be helpful to anybody.
Yeah, and so, for their own good, they're going to try to keep their distance. But, part of my thought about it taking off is, when we're driving woods, we'll spot, the wild horses or wild animals, and you yell, hey, look, and, by the time the crew looks, it's dead. So, it's very common to see something, and, if you don't look, you're going to miss it.
Yeah. What's next for you, Travis? Where are you going to do next?
My next trip is to Hong Kong. I've never been there, but I'm...
Hong Kong, wow.
On December 5th.
Are you married?
No.
No? So you're free to travel where you need to go?
Yeah.
Without any worries and concerns about that. So you're going to be going to Hong Kong, and you're going to continue this particular work. Is there anything that you really want to leave with our audience tonight in regards to this work?
Well, I think it's very important. My main goal is to make people realize that these things, this is a real phenomenon. At the same time, they have to realize that it's not all true. There are misidentified ordinary objects, and the people who are working in this field recognize that.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
people need shape. In my book, I lead with condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance. My main plea is take a look at the evidence.
Good going. And with that, we got to go. Thank you, Travis and Jennifer, for joining us. On the web, TravisWaltonTheMovie.com. Travis's website is www.travis-walton.com. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington, and I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus.